It's Monday, August 25th, 2026. One tanker, one projectile. No casualties reported. That's the entire headline most outlets ran with when news broke that an oil tanker had just been disabled off the coast of Oman, struck by an unidentified projectile while attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz. And if you only read that headline, you'd probably scroll right past it. Another minor incident in a war that's been generating minor incidents for almost 6 months now. But let's actually talk about why this specific kind of strike is worse than it looks. Because underneath that single sentence sits an entire chain of consequences that stretches from a slow motion environmental catastrophe currently unfolding in real time, all the way through to the complete unraveling of what was supposed to be a peace process just days away from being finalized. And once you see how those pieces actually connect, that single throwaway headline stops looking so minor at all. So let's start with what actually happened, because the details matter here more than the headline suggests. According to reporting that surfaced Tuesday, an oil tanker was hit with a projectile off the coast of Oman inside the Strait of Hormuz. An attack that surfaced right in the middle of a high-level diplomatic delegation from Pakistan wrapping up meetings in Tehran, meetings specifically aimed at brokering a negotiated end to what's now approaching a 6-month-old war. Nobody has formally claimed responsibility for this specific strike yet, and that ambiguity itself is worth sitting with for a moment because it's become an almost defining feature of how this entire maritime campaign has unfolded. Ships get hit. Nobody claims it. Everyone assumes Iran because Iran has imposed what amounts to an effective blockade of the strait for months, frequently attacking commercial vessels and demanding the ability to charge tolls for anyone wanting to pass through safely, something the United States has fiercely and consistently opposed since this entire crisis began. And this wasn't an isolated incident, even within just the last few weeks of this already lengthy conflict. Back on August 8th, the UAE formally accused Iran of striking a tanker owned by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, hitting the vessel with a missile as it crossed the strait in the early hours of the morning. The UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs described the strike outright as an act of piracy carried out by the IRGC and called on Tehran to halt these attacks and reopen the strait fully and unconditionally. What followed wasn't a quiet diplomatic murmur. It was a genuinely coordinated wave of condemnation across the entire Gulf region. Qatar condemned the attack and specifically rejected the idea of using the Strait of Hormuz as a bargaining chip, warning that continued closure threatened the interests of every regional state and the global economy as a whole. Saudi Arabia condemned the strike in the strongest possible terms, explicitly framing Iran's continued attacks as a grave breach of international law and a direct violation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2817, holding Tehran fully responsible for the consequences and demanding an immediate halt. Jordan added its own condemnation on top of that, calling it a flagrant violation of international law and affirming full support for the UAE's position. And when you have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan all issuing formal statements within the same news cycle over a single tanker strike, that's a meaningfully unified regional response, not a scattered handful of individual grievances. Now, why does that specific detail matter so much? The fact that this was a vessel owned by ADNOC, a state-owned national oil company, rather than just any random commercial tanker flying a flag of convenience? Because targeting a vessel directly tied to a sovereign Gulf nation's state oil company isn't the same category of act as harassing anonymous commercial shipping, trying to sneak through under cover of darkness. It's a direct message aimed at a specific government, an escalation that treats an entire nation's energy infrastructure as a legitimate military target, rather than treating commercial shipping broadly as collateral pressure in a wider economic standoff. And that distinction is precisely why governments that had otherwise stayed relatively measured in their public statements throughout most of this war suddenly found themselves issuing some of the sharpest language of the entire conflict. That's exactly the kind of distinction that turns regional condemnation from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan from routine diplomatic boilerplate into something considerably more serious, a signal that the entire Gulf Cooperation Council now views Iran's blockade tactics as directly threatening their own sovereign economic assets, not just international shipping passing through their waters. It's also worth noting the specific legal framework being invoked here, because Saudi Arabia's reference to Resolution 2817 wasn't a throwaway diplomatic phrase. Invoking a specific numbered Security Council resolution by name is a deliberate signal that Gulf states view these strikes not merely as unfortunate incidents of an ongoing war, but as documented, legally cognizable violations that could eventually form the basis for formal international accountability proceedings against Iran once this conflict concludes. That's a meaningfully different posture than simply condemning an attack in general terms, and it suggests Gulf governments are already thinking ahead toward how they might eventually hold Tehran accountable through international legal channels for the cumulative damage this blockade has inflicted on regional shipping and regional economies, above and beyond whatever gets negotiated in any near-term ceasefire or peace framework. Let's talk about the scale of what's actually been happening across this entire strait since the war started, because a single ship strike only makes sense in the context of the broader pattern it belongs to. This crisis began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iranian military and nuclear targets, an operation that included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader in the opening hours. In direct retaliation, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz entirely, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began transmitting warnings over VHF radio to every vessel in the area, stating flatly that no ship would be allowed to pass. By early March, the IRGC had formalized that closure, confirming the strait was shut to what it called unfriendly nations, allowing only Iran-approved vessels through. What followed over the subsequent months has been a genuinely brutal toll on maritime traffic in one of the most economically vital waterways on the planet. At least one tugboat has been sunk outright. More than 17 merchant ships have sustained damage, of which at least 7 were abandoned entirely by their crews, rather than risk trying to limp them to safety. 2 merchant ships have actually been captured. 12 seafarers have been killed or gone missing across the various incidents. 1 port worker was killed and 2 more wounded in an attack in Bahrain. And on top of all of that, a separate campaign of Iranian drone strikes specifically targeting Oman hit the ports of Duqm and Salalah, both used by the United States, along with striking 2 additional oil tankers directly, one off the coast of Muscat and another just 5 kilometers north of the port of Kasab. So when you read a headline like 1 tanker disabled off Oman, no casualties reported, you're actually reading entry number however many dozen in an ongoing brutal campaign against commercial shipping that's already claimed a dozen lives, sunk vessels outright, and left ships abandoned and adrift across one of the busiest waterways in the world. The no casualties framing of any individual incident is genuinely good news on its own terms, and it's worth being honest about that. Nobody wants to see seafarers hurt or killed. But treating each individual strike as an isolated low-stakes news item misses the fact that you're watching the continuation of a systematic campaign that has already produced a body count, a captured vessel count, and an abandoned ship count that would be treated as an extraordinary international crisis in almost any other context outside of an active declared war. It's worth pausing on that captured vessel detail specifically because it's one of the more under-discussed dimensions of this entire campaign. 2 merchant ships haven't just been struck or damaged, they've actually been physically boarded and seized by Iranian forces, their crews taken into custody. That's a fundamentally different category of act than a missile strike from a distance because it requires Iranian personnel to physically intercept a vessel, board it, and detain everyone aboard, all while operating inside a waterway that's simultaneously being patrolled by American naval assets and coalition partners actively trying to keep it open. Earlier reporting from before this war even fully escalated documented a similar pattern, with Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy intercepting foreign tankers near Farsi Island, accusing them of smuggling fuel, and detaining crews made up of foreign nationals who were then referred to Iran's own judicial authorities. That's not simply harassment designed to raise insurance costs and slow down shipping traffic. That's Iran asserting a kind of de facto sovereign authority over an international waterway, treating it as territory where Tehran gets to decide who passes, who gets boarded, and who gets detained, entirely outside of any internationally recognized legal framework governing free passage through what's supposed to be shared international waters. Now, let's talk about the part of this story that genuinely deserves the word worse in that title, because there's an environmental catastrophe currently unfolding in slow motion that's gotten dramatically less attention than it deserves. Back in June, a tanker was struck and subsequently ran aground on an uninhabited rocky island somewhere in the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone aboard evacuated long ago. To this day, nobody has taken formal responsibility for the strike that put it there in the first place. Satellite imagery first picked up signs of an oil leak from that grounded vessel on June 30th. And according to John Amos, whose environmental nonprofit, SkyTruth has been tracking the situation continuously since then, by August 7th, an estimated several 100,000 gallons had already spilled into the surrounding waters. 5 of the tanker's 6 cargo holds were reportedly full of oil at the time it was struck, meaning the vessel could have been carrying as much as 40 million gallons total. Read that number again. 40 million gallons sitting inside a grounded, abandoned, leaking tanker, with satellite imagery already documenting dark oil residue collecting in the shallow coastal waters around Keshem Island as of mid-August. John Amos himself has described this specific incident as a potential historic environmental disaster. And that's not hyperbolic language coming from someone with no stake in downplaying or overstating the situation. That's a professional assessment from someone whose entire job is tracking exactly this kind of slow-motion ecological catastrophe using satellite data month after month, incident after incident, long after the news cycle has moved on to whatever the next headline happens to be. Think about the actual mechanics of what's happening here for a second, because it illustrates exactly why this category of attack is so much more dangerous than the headline of any single strike ever conveys. A missile or drone doesn't need to sink a tanker outright to create a genuinely catastrophic outcome. It just needs to disable it badly enough that the vessel runs aground somewhere remote, gets abandoned by its crew for their own safety, and then sits there for weeks with nobody taking responsibility while millions of gallons of crude oil slowly leach into one of the most ecologically sensitive and economically critical marine environments on the planet. That's not a one-day news story. That's an unfolding disaster that keeps compounding for as long as nobody actually goes in to contain it. And in the middle of an active war zone where responsibility gets denied and attribution stays murky, containing a spill like that becomes an enormously more complicated and dangerous undertaking than it would be under normal peacetime conditions. It's worth being specific about why the Strait of Hormuz in particular makes any spill of this size so much more dangerous than a comparable leak somewhere else in open ocean. This is in a wide, deep body of water where currents can dilute contamination over a large area relatively quickly. It's a narrow, semi-enclosed channel bordered by densely populated coastlines, critical fishing grounds, and some of the most economically important desalination plants on the planet, facilities that entire Gulf populations depend on for their drinking water supply. Crude oil contamination reaching the intake systems of a major desalination plant isn't a hypothetical worst-case scenario dreamed up for dramatic effect. It's a genuine operational risk that regional governments have had to actively monitor for throughout this crisis, because a large enough spill drifting into the wrong stretch of coastline could force temporary shutdowns of water treatment infrastructure that millions of people rely on daily. Add in the fact that the strait's confined geography limits how much natural dispersal and dilution can actually occur compared to open ocean. And you start to understand why a single grounded tanker with an estimated 40 million gallon capacity represents something categorically more dangerous than the raw volume number alone would suggest to anyone unfamiliar with the specific geography involved. Let's do the actual strategic analysis here, because there's a specific reason these individual ship strikes carry so much more weight than their surface level coverage suggests. And it comes down to understanding exactly what the Strait of Hormuz actually represents to the global economy. This is a waterway that normally handles somewhere around 20% of the entire world's oil transit, a genuinely staggering concentration of global energy supply funneling through a channel narrow enough that a single well-placed strike, mine, or blockade can meaningfully disrupt the flow of energy to economies on every continent simultaneously. When ships get struck, disabled, abandoned, or captured in a waterway that critical, the consequences don't stay contained to that one vessel or that one shipping company's balance sheet. They ripple outward into global oil prices, into insurance markets that price the risk of transiting the strait, into the confidence of every shipping company deciding whether it's even worth attempting the passage at all. Congressional analysis of this exact crisis has noted that a sustained major disruption to oil flow through the strait could motivate several different international responses, ranging from further ground operations along Iran's coast specifically to neutralize its remaining military capabilities, to an extended status quo of traded attacks continuing indefinitely, to even a scenario where the United States ultimately decides to reduce its own military presence in the region rather than continue absorbing the cost of maintaining it indefinitely. And here's where the timing of this most recent strike matters enormously, because it landed at almost the exact moment a genuine diplomatic breakthrough looked like it might actually be within reach. That Pakistani delegation wrapping up meetings in Tehran wasn't some minor diplomatic courtesy visit. Pakistan has positioned itself as one of the primary mediators trying to broker an actual negotiated end to this war, and reports around this exact period describe Iran's own parliament speaker and top negotiator meeting directly with Pakistan's army chief, specifically to discuss pathways toward ending the conflict. So picture the sequence here. Diplomats are in the room in Tehran, actively working towards some kind of negotiated resolution, and at almost the same moment, a tanker gets hit by an unidentified projectile in the exact waterway that's been the central flashpoint of this entire conflict from the very first week. Whether that timing was a deliberate signal, a rogue IRGC commander acting outside formal authorization, or simply an unfortunate coincidence, given how frequently these attacks have been happening regardless of what's happening diplomatically, the practical effect is the same either way. It's genuinely worth entertaining both explanations for that timing, because they point toward very different conclusions about how much longer this war actually drags on. If this strike represents deliberate signaling from Tehran's central leadership, using a low-cost, deniable attack to remind Gulf states and the shipping industry that Iran still retains meaningful leverage over the waterway, even while sitting across the table from Pakistani mediators, That suggests a regime still negotiating from a position where it believes maintaining some capacity for disruption strengthens its hand rather than undermining the talks. But if this instead reflects a rogue IRGC commander or a loosely coordinated regional cell acting without explicit central authorization, that points towards something arguably more concerning for the long-term prospects of any negotiated settlement. A command structure that's grown fractured enough that Tehran's own negotiators can no longer fully guarantee what happens on the water, even while they're actively negotiating its future in a room hundreds of miles away. Either explanation is genuinely plausible, given everything else we know about how strained and fragmented Iran's command and control has become over 6 months of sustained military pressure, and distinguishing between them matters enormously for anyone trying to assess whether a signed peace agreement would actually translate into verified safety on the water, or whether it would simply be one more piece of paper that individual commanders and proxy elements continue to ignore regardless of what Tehran's official negotiators agree to. It undermines confidence in exactly the process that's supposed to be building toward peace, and it does so in the one specific arena, maritime security in the Strait, where any credible peace deal absolutely has to demonstrate real, verifiable improvement before anyone in the shipping industry will actually trust it enough to resume normal operations. This is really the core reason why any individual strike like this one carries so much more weight than a single incident normally would. Trust in that waterway isn't something that gets rebuilt through a signed piece of paper alone. It gets rebuilt through a sustained period of demonstrated safety, verified by insurance underwriters, shipping companies, and naval escorts, all independently confirming that vessels can actually transit without getting hit. Every single strike, disabled tanker, or unclaimed attack resets that clock. It doesn't matter how close negotiators in Tehran or Washington think they are to a final agreement on paper. If ships are still getting hit by unidentified projectiles in the exact waterway that agreement is supposed to reopen, the diplomatic and the maritime tracks of this entire conflict are fundamentally inseparable, and every time one more vessel gets disabled, it doesn't just cost that specific shipping company money and risk, it resets the trust-building clock for the entire global shipping industry all over again. Let's also talk about the sheer economic toll this has already taken, because the numbers involved genuinely dwarf what most people probably assume, given how each individual incident gets covered as a relatively small, isolated story. At the peak of the closure, more than 150 tankers were stranded in the Arabian Gulf, unable to move either direction through the strait, sitting essentially frozen in place, while insurance premiums for anyone willing to risk the transit spiked to levels that made attempting the passage financially irrational for most operators. Shipping traffic through the strait, which normally runs somewhere around 130 vessels a day under peacetime conditions, has at various points collapsed to as low as 10 vessels daily. And even with periodic upticks as diplomatic progress has occasionally raised hopes of reopening, traffic has generally hovered around only a fifth of its normal pre-war volume for most of the past several months. That's not a temporary hiccup in global shipping logistics. That's a fundamental, sustained disruption to one of the most critical arteries in the entire global energy supply chain, and every single individual strike, no matter how minor it looks in a headline, is one more data point telling every shipping company and every insurance underwriter around the world that the risk calculus for using this waterway still hasn't fundamentally changed. Let's talk about the insurance mechanics underneath all of this too, because that's actually where the long-term economic damage from strikes like this one really compounds, well beyond whatever direct cost gets absorbed by the specific shipping company that owned the disabled vessel. Maritime war risk insurance for a waterway, like the Strait of Hormuz, gets priced dynamically based on the recent frequency and severity of incidents in that specific corridor, meaning every single strike, whether it causes catastrophic damage or barely disables a single tanker, feeds directly back into how underwriters price the next policy for the next ship attempting the same transit. That's precisely why traffic through the strait has stayed suppressed at roughly a fifth of pre-war volume, even during periods when diplomatic negotiations have seemed to be making real progress. Because insurance markets don't reprice risk based on optimistic diplomatic headlines, they reprice it based on the actual measurable frequency of vessels getting hit. A single unclaimed strike like the one that happened this week doesn't just cost the owner of that specific tanker. It resets the risk premium calculation for every other shipping company still weighing whether attempting the strait is worth the cost, which is exactly why the volume of traffic through this waterway has remained so stubbornly depressed for months on end, even as the broader diplomatic track has periodically shown signs of genuine progress. And let's talk about the response side of this equation too, because the United States hasn't simply been sitting back watching these strikes happen without consequence. Central Command has run repeated operations specifically targeting the tools Iran has used to maintain this blockade, releasing footage of missile strikes that obliterated 16 Iranian mine layers positioned near the strait, vessels that had been actively seeding the waterway with sea mines as part of the broader effort to keep it closed to anyone without Iranian approval. There have been proposals floated for direct American military escorts for tankers attempting to transit the strait, an idea that's generated its own share of controversy and complications, including one notable episode where the Energy Secretary posted a claim about a successful escort operation that the administration subsequently had to walk back as erroneous. That kind of stumble matters too, because it shows just how difficult it's proven to actually deliver on the promise of guaranteed safe passage, even with the full weight of American naval power theoretically available to enforce it. Every strike that gets through, despite that military presence, is one more reminder that credible deterrence in this specific waterway has proven genuinely difficult to establish, no matter how much firepower gets deployed to the region. And that gap between visible military commitment and actual verified safety on the water is exactly the kind of gap that keeps eroding confidence every single time a new incident like this week's tanker strike makes headlines. There's also a deeper strategic pattern worth understanding here about why Iran keeps returning to individual ship strikes as a tactic, even as its broader military position across this conflict has deteriorated dramatically in nearly every other domain. A single strike against a single tanker is cheap. It requires a fraction of the resources that a full-scale naval confrontation would demand, and it can be carried out with plausible deniability baked directly into the tactic itself, since attribution for any individual strike frequently remains genuinely unclear for days or weeks afterward, exactly the way this most recent incident off Oman has played out. But the cumulative effect of dozens of these individually cheap, individually deniable strikes adds up to something with an outsized strategic impact relative to the actual military resources Iran has to expend to carry them out. You don't need a full battle fleet to keep global shipping companies nervous about using a waterway. You just need enough unclaimed, unpredictable strikes happening often enough that no insurance underwriter is willing to price the risk as anything close to normal. And that's exactly the dynamic that's kept traffic through the strait, suppressed at roughly a fifth of its pre-war volume for months on end, using a fraction of the military capability that Iran would need to actually contest control of that waterway through direct attributable force. There's a term analysts have started using for exactly this kind of approach, describing it as asymmetric maritime denial, and it's worth understanding why that concept applies so precisely to what's been happening in the strait for the better part of 6 months now. Traditional naval blockades historically required a dominant fleet capable of physically intercepting and turning back every vessel attempting passage, an enormously resource-intensive undertaking that Iran's navy, especially after months of losses to American and Israeli strikes, simply doesn't have the capability to sustain through conventional means anymore. But asymmetric maritime denial doesn't require that kind of sustained conventional dominance at all. It only requires enough periodic, unpredictable, hard-to-attribute strikes to keep the psychological and financial cost of transiting the waterway elevated in the minds of every shipping company and every insurance underwriter making decisions about whether any individual voyage is actually worth the risk. That's a fundamentally cheaper, more sustainable strategy for a military that's already lost the vast majority of its conventional naval deterrent, and it explains why these individual strikes have continued happening with such stubborn regularity, even as nearly every other dimension of Iran's military campaign in this war has collapsed under sustained American and Israeli pressure. So think about what that means for how you should actually read a headline like the one that broke this week. One tanker, one projectile. No casualties reported. On its own, that reads like a minor, almost forgettable news item buried somewhere in the middle of a longer roundup of Middle East developments. But understood in the context of everything actually happening around it, a nearly 6-month-old blockade that's already sunk a tugboat, damaged more than 17 merchant vessels, killed a dozen seafarers, captured 2 ships outright, and left an abandoned tanker leaking what could be as much as 40 million gallons of crude oil into one of the most ecologically sensitive waters on the planet, all while diplomats were literally in the room in Tehran trying to negotiate an actual end to this entire crisis. That same headline becomes something considerably more consequential. It's not really a story about one ship. It's a story about whether the fundamental premise underlying any potential peace deal, the idea that this waterway can actually become safe again, still holds up against the reality of what keeps happening on the water, regardless of what's being discussed in any negotiating room. And it's worth remembering just how quickly confidence in a waterway like this can evaporate compared to how slowly it actually gets rebuilt. It took years of relatively stable, incident-free operation to establish the Strait of Hormuz as a route shipping companies and insurers treated as routine, low-risk transit before this war ever began. It's taken less than 6 months of intermittent strikes, most of them individually small enough to generate exactly the kind of forgettable headline this most recent incident produced, to collapse that confidence down to roughly a fifth of normal traffic volume. Rebuilding it back to anything resembling pre-war levels isn't going to happen the moment a ceasefire gets signed in Tehran or Washington. It's going to require months, quite possibly years, of sustained, genuinely verified safety. The kind of track record that simply cannot be established, while incidents like this week's disabled tanker keep happening every few weeks, with no clear attribution and no consequence anyone can point to. And that's ultimately the honest answer to why this specific category of incident is worse than it looks every single time it happens. It's not that any individual strike represents some uniquely catastrophic escalation on its own. It's that each one functions as a small but genuinely corrosive data point against the entire theory that this conflict is actually winding down. Every unclaimed strike keeps insurance premiums elevated. Every disabled tanker keeps shipping companies rerouting around the strait entirely rather than risking the transit. Every environmental disaster quietly unfolding in the background, like that grounded tanker still leaking oil into Keshim Island's coastal waters as we speak, adds a slower-burning, longer-term cost that won't fully register in headlines until the scale of the damage becomes undeniable months or years down the road. And every single time one of these incidents lands right in the middle of active diplomatic talks, it reinforces the deeply uncomfortable possibility that no matter how close negotiators get to a signed agreement on paper, the actual security situation on the water isn't improving at anywhere near the pace the diplomatic track would suggest. What do you think happens from here? Does this latest strike end up being just one more entry in an already long list of unclaimed, unresolved incidents that gets absorbed into the broader pattern without derailing the current diplomatic push? Or does it end up being the specific incident that finally convinces Gulf states and shipping companies that no negotiated framework is actually worth trusting until they see months of genuinely verified, incident-free transit through that strait first? Let me know what you think down in the comments, because I think the answer to that question is going to shape whether this war actually winds down in the coming weeks or drags on well into the fall. If you found this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps get this kind of detailed analysis in front of more people instead of just the surface level version of the story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that too, because this situation is still evolving fast, and there's a lot more still coming as it develops. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.